few months ago, I left my beloved UN Women to join UNAIDS. A very dear friend of mine called me and she said, UNAIDS? Is there still AIDS? And I said to her, actually, there is. 40 years later, 38 million people still living with HIV. 37 million dead from HIV. The good news is that of those 38 million, a whole lot of them, maybe about 80% of them, have treatment, have what it takes to be able to live a healthy life with HIV. And so, as we look forward, the Sustainable Development Goals, end of AIDS is possible by 2030. And I turned to her and I said, this is why I joined UNAIDS, because I want to see this end. And so she asked me, so why are we still not done? I said to her, look, we've made a lot of progress. It's been great. But there are taps that are still leaking. There's infections that are still taking place. And so we began to discuss the fact that in many countries across the world, people living with HIV continue to deal with stigma and discrimination. Gender non-conforming people don't access justice, can't access services. Sex workers, criminalized, can't access the rights they need to be able to actually get the treatment. And they're very, very, very susceptible to HIV and more and more and more. But on this continent of ours, the greatest threat to the end of AIDS is the 4,200 girls that are infected every single week with HIV. But let me tell you why. Why we have 4,200 girls infected every single week with HIV. And I call this the paradox of blessings. And the paradox of blessings because, let's look back at COVID-19. So for the last 2 years, most of us have been home, locked down, blessed to be locked down in our homes, safe in our homes. And so after a year and a half of us being locked away, across the world broke out the news that thousands and thousands and thousands of girls showed up pregnant. 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, Malawi, Kenya, Namibia, South Africa, all over our region. Teenage girls showed up pregnant from the safety of their own homes. A blessing or a curse? And then we had the privilege of visiting the beautiful Maluti Mountains in Lesotho recently. We visited a school. This school had about 198 children at the school. We learned from these children that during the course of the year, 40 girls were sold by their parents to early marriage. That their parents, pushed to the edge, were forced to sell them, seemingly, to a better life. And so, very, very unlike Lesotho, we were shocked that these were the choices that parents were left with. Is this a blessing or a curse? And then there's the blessers. Young girls, beautiful, sexually ready, are forced to make the choice to eat, to sleep, to go to school, to buy airtime, only because they have a blesser. A blesser is a man, like a sugar daddy in many parts of the world, 10 years plus her senior, who opts to violate this girl, transact with her, for her sex, owning her, abusing her, very often unprotected. So the paradox of blessings explains to you why it is that here we are in Africa, 4,200 girls infected every single day from HIV. But you know, there's been huge efforts to turn this game around. Huge efforts. There is a wonderful, wonderful hero of mine. Her name is Chief Kachindamoto of Malawi. This wonderful warrior chief is a real warrior against child marriage. And this is a woman chief who took the decision that she was going to end early marriages in Malawi in her village. And so there she walks from house to house, literally yanking out these girls and their babies out of that house, annulling marriages, 3,000 plus marriages, and taking them back to school. In fact, she's established a school where she takes these children and their children. But as we would have it, these same children that Chief Kachindamoto has been working with, many of them, close to 50% of them, with HIV. And so, as we have our parents selling a child like this, very often you find that their young bodies, too young to take the urgency of an older man, will tear and is highly then susceptible to HIV infection. But then we also, actually just 2 weeks ago, a week ago, it was last week, I was in Rwanda. And what I learned is that in Rwanda, yes, there were some teenage pregnancies, but what did happen is that every teenage pregnancy that's exposed, they go out and hunt for whoever is responsible for it and lock them up. Zero tolerance to the abuse of underage girls. So there is hope. Some of you may have heard about the he for she movement. This is a movement that invited men to really take responsibility and stand beside women for gender equality. One of the most impressive programs of the he for she movement is a taverns program that focused on working with men who are patrons of taverns, where because of alcohol and the culture, the toxic masculinity in the taverns, high levels of abuse of women and girls. And so this program, the taverns work together, tavern owners and patrons, having dialogues about, is this the kind of life that we want to have? And believe it or not, 144 taverns in South Africa work together to change the norms, change the behavior, change the culture of abuse, and even make sure that those who had violated went to court, murderers were taken to court. In fact, we have at least 2 men who are behind bars today because of the work of these taverns, murderers who had disappeared and were brought back to the table. So there are wonderful efforts, islands of hope that many, many, many of us are involved in. But still, 4,200 girls every single week. So what do we need to do? We have an unparalleled opportunity. We're 9 years away from the end of AIDS. We have the opportunity to accelerate actions, to find and build our strongest energy to push towards a result. But you know, I don't know if you're like me, but every day I switch the TV on. And what do I see in the news? More and more and more abuse. And I'm kind of paralyzed into inaction because I don't know what to do. And so I started thinking, where have there been successes? Who has done work that has worked that we can learn from? And I remembered the beautiful story of the women of Liberia. I don't know how many of you know this story, but the women of Liberia in the 90s. Liberia is a country that had been in civil war for years. And this was the second civil war, a long, more than 10-year long civil war. And the women had been watching helplessly as their daughters were raped. Their sons were made into killing machines, murdering their own families. The villages were burnt. The entire country was up in arms. And the women stood and one day mobilized their collective discontent and took the decision that enough is enough. And so together, Islamic women, Christian women, older women, younger women, all in white, stood together in non-violent protest to take on this civil war. But guess what else they did? They went on a sex strike. No man in Liberia had sex for that period because they used what they knew was in their power. And so here these Liberian women, all in the streets. The best part, they told the men, you will negotiate and come to an agreement. So the men took a decision and they flew over to Ghana to do this negotiation. So off they go to Ghana, and the women followed them. Right behind them, buses, whatever it took, from Liberia to Ghana, off they went. And they made this huge circle around the hall where the negotiations were taking place. And they told the men, not one of you steps out of this room until you come up with an agreement. And so some of the men tried to escape. Every time they were mad, you know men. They wouldn't let it happen. They surrounded the room. And so for days, the women stood there, all in white, and refused to budge, stood their ground, and the men sat in that room until an agreement was reached. The civil war ended that day, and they went ahead and elected the first ever African woman president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Right? So, what now? We have 4,200 girls every single week. What can we do? How do we mobilize our collective discontent? How do we gather that energy that all of you sit with every day as you watch the horror of the reality? And as you listen to my story, thinking, what can I do? Many things, but here are 3 things. And let's learn from the Liberian woman. The first thing is that young women in our beloved continent organize. They organize. I can name hundreds of organizations that young women have created, that young women have mobilized. They organize. And with very little resources, they push to change the culture of norms that results in their abuse. They change laws. They challenge men. They really do everything within their power, using their agency to transform. Now, here we are, many of us from all over the world with resources. Imagine if we stood behind these young women. We told their story. We changed their story. We worked with them to imagine a different future. And that we amplify their voices, gather the resources they need, and create a full movement of girls who can truly, truly, truly transform their own lives because they refuse and they surround the room where the decisions are being made and they will not move until there is agreement that abuse is no longer tolerated in their lives. So let's amplify their voices. So that's the first one. The second one is that we have 30 million girls in our beloved continent who are out of school. We know that if girls stay in school to the end of secondary school, they have a 4 times higher chance of staying HIV negative. So the 30 million who are out, we have got to do whatever we can to get them back in school. So a big agenda is getting young girls back to school, retaining those who are in school to the end of school, and resourcing those as they leave school, that they know where to go. What are the opportunities? This business of girls on the street because they can't find jobs or they can't find opportunities, an end to that. So I sat down thinking, what can we do? Now, it costs $30 or so. I mean, how much does a blesser or a sugar daddy give a young woman in exchange for her sex? I don't know, $20, $30? per month for all her supplies. If we give $30 to a young woman, she will opt out of a transactional relationship that's risky for her. So there is a solution, right? We know that for $4, it's about a 30% chance then that she will go into a child marriage. So we're able to, invest in keeping her in the school. And there are many, many more numbers that I can quote. But what we know is that if we have the right resources, we can keep the girls in school. We can support the girls so that they grow. We can make sure that these HIV numbers drop and that we really are pushing to the end of AIDS. And so $30 million. $30 million could actually take back the 1 million girls in our continent who are out of school because of COVID. 1 million girls, 30 million of them could go back to school and get rid of their blessers and get back on track. So we have African billionaires in our lives. I'm sure some of you know them. We have African billionaires who are linked to global billionaires clubs. If we could just convince them to forget about the yachts for a couple of months, worry about going to space for now, but just come and invest in this global fund for education, for educating, retaining, returning, resourcing these girls, then we could truly look forward and imagine a future for young girls. My final proposal, I call my brothers keepers. You see, men have to do the work. It's enough work for girls and women to change our own lives because of your abuse. So we invite you, men, we invite you to join the Brothers Keepers movement. This is a movement where we invite you or challenge you to call out your fellow men who abuse young girls, right? We invite you to be the ones to make sure that every girl who needs to get home safe does that because you've created a safe passage for her to get home. We want to make sure you are working hard to change the norms, working with your faith leaders, working with whoever designs this culture of toxicity. That's your business, men. And if you can create this transformation, then we can focus on amplifying the young women's voices. We can focus on building the resources we need to educate these girls and keep them in school. So you do your work, we'll do ours. And together we can create that future that we can truly imagine that transforms the lives, puts AIDS behind us, and gives us a real future. In the next 9 years, the end of AIDS is possible. We learn from the Liberian woman, our collective discontent. We mobilize our energy, and we truly, truly can change the game. Thank you.